Good morning, everyone. We are going to be starting promptly at 10 o'clock. We're going to let everybody who is going to join us join. So we'll be starting in about a minute. Okay, it's 10 o'clock. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Danville's Housing 101 workshop. I'd like to introduce the project team on the Zoom call this morning. My name is Diane Friedman. I am the Deputy Director of Development Services for the town of Danville. We're also joined by Dave Crompton, who's Danville's Chief of Planning, Kat Bravo, our Administrative Analyst in Development Services, and Diana Elrod, who is the consultant that is working with us throughout the housing element update process. Next slide, please. I'd like to present an overview of the intent of this workshop. The intent this morning is to inform, and we will cover three primary areas. Number one, we'll cover the background and context to the housing element and what is impacting decisions around the housing element process. We will probably share more with you than you've ever wanted to know about the housing element. And the third objective is to have you participate in the process and the roles of the elected and appointed officials. So we'll cover the why, the what, the how, and the who. Lastly, we will be here to answer any questions that you may have. If you look at the slide in the lower left-hand corner, you can text us comments that will appear in our communication portal throughout the webinar. The number is 838-484-3328. We will also be taking questions. There is a Q&A box that you can use at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please feel free to ask us any questions. We will be doing Q&A and we will stay here as long as it takes to answer everybody's questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to do a short poll rather than talking at you for the entirety of this session. We've structured this workshop to be a little bit interactive. So will you please fill out the poll? It's a warm-up activity. We'd like to see if you could help us get a better sense of our audience and get to know you. Okay, a few more. Okay, so 67% live in Danville, 11% work in Danville, 33% of you shop, dine, and play in Danville, and 56% all of the above. All right, thank you very much for allowing us a little insight to who our audience is today. Next slide. Okay, so, I'm sorry, next slide, Kat. Okay, so we're going to set the stage for our discussion with some background and context. Next slide, please. We're going to start by talking about California housing trends, and acknowledge that for a long time now, it's been very expensive to live in California. If you look at the screen, there's a 2015 report by the State Legislative Analyst Office that illustrates the disparity between California's housing costs and the rest of the nation has grown dramatically over the decades. From 1940, California home prices were 20% above the US. In 1980, 80% above the US. In 2015, 150% above the US. In 2019, 218% above the US. And you can also see the disparity as far as rents. These numbers, they're the most recent numbers that we have. The California Legislative Analyst Office is a bipartisan analyst office in Sacramento, and they do lots of reporting so that legislators can make decisions on legislation. We also received some of this information from the American Community Survey in 2019, and we can expect those numbers to be higher in 2021. Next slide, please. California housing trends. The Legislative Analyst Office report concludes that growth in housing costs is the result of a housing supply shortage. If you look at the California coast, most of our major, I call them metropolitan cities, are on the coast of California. And the housing supply shortage, you can see from the 1940s, the housing supply stock has dropped dramatically along the coast, and it is going up inland, which is people are moving further and further away from job centers to be able to afford housing. Next slide, please. Continuing along the theme of California's housing trends, now we look at annual permitting for housing units. The Legislative Analyst Office report's conclusions are reflected in a 2018 report by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, better known as HCD. In the HCD report, the number of permits issued for housing units, it's a leading indicator of housing construction, has never recovered from the Great Recession. If you look in the 1960s, the most amount, or the 1980s, the most amount of housing permits that California has issued is over 300,000. If you look at the Great Recession in 2008, we've never recovered, and we have significantly, as a state, been under 100,000 housing units, which is really dramatically contributing to the housing shortage supply in the state. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about why this is. The Legislative Analyst Office, it's due to 5 primary factors. The first one is community resistance to growth. People that live in suburban areas, when you talk about growth, you talk about traffic, you talk about noise, and so there is resistance to growth in communities. The second is the attractiveness of higher tax generating land use. It is the tax revenue for a commercial development is higher than a residential development. So you have developers that are really focused, and also cities that are more focused on the tax generating land uses. There's also limited land to build on given California's geography. The cost of development is increasingly higher and higher. The housing that is needed in the state is low and extremely low income housing, and it costs the same amount to build a market rate house than it does in a low or extremely low rate rental or housing unit. So when you look at the margin or the profit, again, developers are incentivized to build market rate housing. The fifth reason is project delays due to lengthy local review processes and abuse of the California Environmental Quality Act, or also known as CEQA, to stop new housing development. So all of these factors significantly impact the amount of housing stock that is built, and that continues that negative housing trend. Next slide, please. So what is happening now is the state has, over the last, since about 2017, has been intervening more and more to solve this problem legislatively. In fact, prior to the pandemic, housing production was a central focus when Governor Newsom first ran for office. His inaugural address included a goal of building 3.5 million housing units by 2025. And, this is a stretch goal at best, because that means the entire state would need to produce over 850,000 units annually in the next 4 years. And as you saw the housing permits chart, that is far more than we have ever built in this state. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the state is intervening more and more legislatively to really help solve the problem. And as the state continues to intervene legislatively, they take more and more decision-making authority away from local elected officials, your town council. Housing has been a priority for the state legislature, and over the past 4 years, 64 bills have been passed intended to expedite housing construction in the state. In 2021 alone, 28 bills have been introduced, with SB 9, which the governor just signed this week, receiving press attention given its intent to eliminate single-family zoning. So the governor has signed a bill that effectively has eliminated single-family zoning in the state of California. It is estimated that 65% of land use is locked up in single-family zoning. So the objective of the legislature is to unlock that and allow densification of single-family neighborhoods. SB 9 creates duplexes on existing lots and allows an owner to invoke a lot split, which will allow them to upzone or densify a total number of 4 units. SB 9 is also known as the Duplex Bill. And that bill will be, it was signed and it will be chaptered, and it will take effect on January 1st of 2022. And it is getting a lot of press attention this week, obviously, because it has been signed and we have been talking about it for the entire year. So if there's one takeaway from part 1 of this workshop, it is now that the state laws, not local laws, not your town council, now increasingly govern how Danville and other cities must review, approve, and plan for housing. Next slide, please. So we're going to transition into another component. You have the state legislature getting involved in this, and then we are now transitioning into the housing element and how that is going to impact us. With the social political context, I'd like to transition to Diana to dive into the nuts and bolts of the housing element and what it means to Danville.
Thanks. Why do we need a housing element? Well, the short answer is to comply with a state housing element law that was enacted back in 1969. The law acknowledges that cities do not build housing. Instead, it requires each city to accommodate its fair share of the state's projected housing needs by planning for growth and removing constraints to that growth. Next slide, please. But as Diane noted earlier, a growing number of recently adopted state laws now collectively constrain how cities develop their housing elements. We'll talk more about this in a minute. Next slide. What is a housing element? It's a plan that demonstrates to the state of California, because they have to approve it, how we would accommodate the housing that is needed in our community. This is the only element of the general plan that must be approved by the state. The key here is that the state and regional agencies, as Diane mentioned, not the town, determines what the need is and what the issues are that should be addressed. It's also updated, the housing element is updated every 8 years, and the period that we're developing plan for is 2023 to 2031. Next slide, please. Well, what's in it? It includes a housing plan with goals, policies, and objectives. It contains an analysis of needs and evaluation of constraints, both governmental and non-governmental constraints, and the identification of sites to meet those needs. And this is perhaps the most controversial, even though an owner always has the choice of deciding what they want to do with their property. Next slide. So now it's time for our next activity. And we've talked a lot about projected housing needs. And which group do you believe is in charge of developing those housing projections? The results will be displayed at the 30-second mark. Yet again, we forgot our Jeopardy theme song. Kat, how are we doing? So one of you says federal government, 4 people or 40% say state government, some said regional government, and others say city councils and boards of supervisors. Well, actually, it's a trick question. It's a combination of both state and regional governments, and we'll explain a little bit more about that later. Next slide, please. So the foundation of the housing element is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, which is pronounced RHNA, which involves 3 levels of government. At the state level, the role of the state is to produce housing projections every year for every region in the state. And these targets are then assigned to regions within California, and for us, it's in the Bay Area. And the state assigned the San Francisco Bay Area 441,176 units for this 2023-2031 cycle. And this is more than 2.5 times what it was in the prior cycle. The regional planning agency allocates that assignment to individual cities and counties. And at the local level, only then at the very end of the process do local cities and counties play a role. And the designated role here is to find the land that can accommodate our regional housing assignment. Next slide. What does it mean for Danville? Right now, it means that we have to find land for a minimum of 2,241 housing units for the 8-year planning period. And note that this is a minimum number. We'll talk more about that later. Next slide, please. It's important to note that the assignment isn't 2,241 new single-family homes, but rather homes that have to be affordable in 4 different income categories. This chart demonstrates that each income category is benchmarked to a percentage of the county's area median income. That is, the number of households above the median is equal to the number of households below the median. And as a reference point, Contra Costa's area median income, or AMI, for a family of 4 is $119,000 per year. That means there are an equal number of households above that amount and below that amount. At one of the income spectrum, a very low income family of 4 earns 50% of AMI, which turns out to be about $65,000 per year. And at the other end of the spectrum, an above moderate income family of 4 is in excess of $143,000 per year. The income categories matter because higher density zone land is necessary, especially to meet the lower income housing needs. For example, the units affordable to the lowest income category must be built at least 30 dwelling units per acre in order to accommodate affordable housing. Next slide. You'll see here on this slide, which we won't spend too much time on, but this is a list of all the allocations for the remaining cities in Contra Costa County. Note that that Concord has over 5,000 units. Richmond has over 3,000 units. San Ramon has over 5,000 units. And actually, the unincorporated areas of the county include more than 7,000 units. Next slide, please. You might ask, who gave us this assignment, this RHNA allocation? And in reference to an earlier slide, it's the San Francisco Bay Area's regional planning agency called the Association of Bay Area Governments, pronounced ABAG. And one of ABAG's responsibilities is to develop a method of distributing the 441,000 units assigned to the Bay Area region to its 101 cities and 9 counties. Next slide, please. And yet another activity. What main factor do you think ABAG used in its methodology to allocate the Bay Area's 441,000 unit assignment? Cities with high socioeconomic resources, access to jobs, access to transit, cities with enough natural resources to support growth, etc. And according to our poll, 20% said cities with high socioeconomic resources, 13% access to jobs, 40% transit, an additional other factors, and 13%. Well, the actual answer is complicated and much more involved than you'd think. And it depends on the income category. Next slide, please. Recall our discussion about units within different income categories. You'll note that on the left-hand side, you can see in the orange boxes very low, and on the right-hand side, a moderate and above moderate income. Essentially, the methodology used different factors depending upon the income category. For low and very low income units, it was primarily focused on the access to high opportunity areas, with some distribution with job proximity via auto or job proximity via transit. On the right-hand side, mod and above mod units was primarily access to jobs via auto. It's presumed that people of higher incomes, generally speaking, do not use public transportation. And high access to high opportunity areas was also included, but not as strongly as for the lower income. And just we didn't make this graphic, so don't blame us. Next slide, please. Okay, what's at stake for non-compliance? And some folks have already asked, what happens if the town decides not to comply? Unfortunately, there are a lot of downsides to not complying with this law. Remember, it's not a requirement to build, but a requirement to plan for units. What happens is we would receive limited access to state funding, such as transportation dollars used to repave roads and repair roads. The court can impose fines up to $600,000 per month, and even if Danville residents are willing to forego the revenue in the form of state fundings and fines, there's a legal risk and a loss of control that means that courts can mandate our compliance by approving housing projects on our behalf without local input and suspending the town's ability to issue building permits. Next slide, please. With this, I'll turn it over to Dave for a discussion on an actual project.
Thank you, Diana, and good morning, everybody. So as Diana mentioned previously, we have to provide our RHNA assignment at different affordability levels. And so this kind of case study that I'm going to walk through describes the significant challenges that the town has, and certainly other cities like Danville have in providing for the lower income units, the low and very low. And I'm going to use the recently approved and occupied Luxon Riverwalk project in downtown Danville as an example. So you're all probably familiar with this. This is the new project that's there on Diablo Road next to the freeway. And that was actually a site that was one of our RHNA sites that we changed as part of our last housing element. Previously, it was a office site, and we changed it to a multifamily site at least 30 units per acre. And so we actually had 144 units approved there. However, in this case, the developer invoked what's called the state density bonus law. And this is one of those laws that you saw on the earlier slides. And this law basically says that if a developer will commit to doing additional affordability, as far as actually deed restricting units to be affordable, they get a automatic density bonus. So this project actually ended up to be built at about 40 units per acre. However, we got the 10 units that are deed restricted, and the rest are renting at market rate. And so at market rate in Danville, even for this density of a apartment project, those are renting for around $2,600 up to about $5,000 a month. And so those are not considered low, very low, or even moderate income units. Those are actually above moderate income units. So we got the 10 very low. We expected to get 144 because this was zoned over 30 units an acre. And so that kind of gets us into another state law that was adopted recently, and that's the no net loss law. That basically says that if you approve a site in your housing element and you've designated it to provide a certain number of affordable housing units, and it doesn't, you have to make that up somewhere else. And so we only got 10. That means we were 134 short of our low and very low on that particular site. And so that basically puts us in the hole already for our next housing element, our current housing element cycle that we are planning for. And so you can see where that's going to be a problem over and over again in Danville. Our cost of lands are such that at market rate, we just don't get affordable. And that's earlier on, Diana talked about at least having 2,000 2,241 units, because we have to have a buffer built into our WINA to plan for these types of shortfalls. So the state is asking for some level of a buffer. It could be as much as 30% additional units above our WINA assignment. Next slide, please. And so taking a little bit more of a dive down into Danville's actual experience with affordable housing, there's a term out there called housing cost burden, and that's a concept that basically says that no household should have to spend more than 30% of their monthly income on housing, and that includes utilities. And so if you have to spend more than 30% of your income, then you're cost burdened, and that takes away from your ability to provide for other wants or needs that you may have. Next slide, please. And so this is a little survey we did on existing multifamily projects throughout Danville. These were projects probably approved over the last 20 years or so. And this shows their affordability level given this cost burdening requirement that not more than 30% of your income go towards housing. And you can see that for very low, if you're in that category that was shown on an earlier slide, where you're 50% of the county median income or less, and you have to provide, we're looking at that 30%, well, we're up to, you'd actually have to pay 78% at the Alexa Riverwalk, obviously very much cost burdened. And that applies to all the very low incomes for all of the recently approved multifamily projects in Danville. None of them would be affordable to very low with the cost burdening. For low, there are some that would be available, and a few more at the moderate income level. And so importantly, if you look at the most recent project, the Alexa Riverwalk, which reflects our current land use values and construction costs, et cetera, no units at the densities that we're approving them at, even 30 plus units an acre, are affordable with cost burdening to low, very low, or even moderate income housing families. So next slide, please. So participating in the process, hopefully, by now, based on what we're saying, your interest is being piqued, or maybe even more, you're becoming a little bit concerned about how we're going to accommodate this. And you probably want to talk to your friends and family and get them involved and follow along in the process. So we've launched, we think it's very, very important to get this information out to the community and get as much participation in this process as we can. And so we've launched a program where we're doing this public outreach. We have created a very nice website that has a lot of information and links to the state laws, and it's kind of an interactive website where we can get input from the public. And Diane's gonna talk a little bit about that more in a moment. So beginning earlier this summer and even into the spring, we've been putting out these Housing 101 workshops. We've done them all summer. We've also been reaching out to individual groups and clubs. We've met with the Exchange Club, Kiwanis, a Rotary Club, and others. We are going to be talking with the Chamber and with the Veterans Group here coming up. So if there's any groups out there that may be interested in having an individual presentation like this, we can even come out to you. We'd very much like to do that, because our goal is really to get this information out to the public. And so going forward, what is our timeline to get this all, our next housing element done and approved? So part of the process is that we will have to find sites that can accommodate these 2,241 units at least. And so that's something we will begin to do, and that's something we're asking the public to help us with. Once we start dialing in on what might be appropriate sites to rezone and change the general plan on to accommodate housing, we'll have to do an environmental review of that. That will be an environmental impact report. We have hired an environmental consultant to prepare that report. So that will look at things like traffic impacts, biological impacts, air quality, noise, provision of services like water and sewer. So that'll all be done as part of the EIR. We are working on kind of more non-controversial technical components of the housing element, like our current community profile for housing barriers, our current housing stock, etc. Once we have a draft housing element that we believe meets the requirements of the state as far as our housing numbers, we'll submit that to HCD, which is the California Department of Housing and Community Development. So as Diana said, this is the one element of our general plan that requires state approval. They have 60 days to get back to us and give us feedback on whether or not they believe that our draft housing element meets their requirements. If it doesn't, they'll point out what we need to do, and so we will go ahead and make adjustments. Then we'll start through a public hearing process, and that will include both our planning commission and town council, and ultimately we will have to submit our housing element to the state for review and approval by the end of January of 2023. Next slide, please. And so the actual formal process, again, includes holding public hearings in front of our planning commission. The planning commission is a volunteer group of 7 that are appointed by the town council. We'll hold public hearings. They will look at the whole package of approvals, which would include both the housing element as well as the environmental impact report, as well as any the rezonings and the general plan amendments that would go along with that. Then ultimately, planning commission makes a recommendation to the town council, and it's the town council that will take the final actions on approving the housing element and the other related documents. And again, that needs to be done by the end of January of 2023. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn this back over to Diane, and she's going to go a little bit more into depth on our websites and opportunities to participate that way. So Diana, or Diane. You're on mute, Diane.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Dave. As Dave mentioned, this is a long process, and we've launched an online engagement portal at www.danvilletowntalks.org. Its purpose is to serve as a source of facts about the laws and the processes that we're undergoing here with the housing element update. Capture and respond to questions. I mentioned texting at the beginning of the presentation. We definitely want to hear. We're reaching out during this entire process using multi-vehicles, including our newsletter, social media. We present information at the town council meeting. Every month I do a report, a legislative update at the town council meeting. We have a legislative committee where we talk about the bills that are impacting this process. We've sent out a survey. So we're going to continue to reach out and use these tools so that you can participate in informing the town council when they are making the decision at the end of this process. It also helps. We also would like you to participate in quick polls on this site. So please check this site out, register for this site, and we will be providing input throughout this process. We are also working with developing an interactive tool that we are going to launch in the spring that will allow you to have input into some of the areas that are going to be impacted by this process. So please follow along with us as we continue to do outreach on this process. Next slide, please. So when we talk about ways to participate, you can subscribe to our newsfeed at the town portal, danvilletowntalks.org. Learn about housing and its governing legislation to provide informed input. And I just mentioned that on the second town council, which is the third week of every month, I present a legislative update about what's happening in Sacramento. The legislative session has just ended. I will be providing an update on Tuesday at our town council meeting. We have legislative committees the fourth Tuesday of every month. We publish agendas. They are all recorded. You can go back and you can look at the history of how we track legislation and how we talk about legislation. Our mayor and our town council member and our town manager are involved in that committee of making decisions on legislation and how we advocate on behalf of the town. You can engage in the process by spreading the word and attending any future workshops, asking questions, participating in surveys, contributing ideas, and again, texting us at 838-484-3328. We want to hear your story, your housing story in Danville. Next slide, please. So the RHNA appeal is the next milestone in this process. On July 9th, the town submitted an appeal to ABAG, and ABAG will conduct a public hearing to consider the appeal. Danville's appeal will be heard via Zoom this Friday, coming up September 24th. We are on between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. If you would like to view submitted appeals, comments, or join the RHNA mailing list for appeal updates, you can visit the website below at ABAG to follow along in the process as well. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, this is really, really important and why we are very actively involved in legislative advocacy. We work with a coalition of the Tri-Valley cities, Livermore, Pleasanton, Dublin, San Ramon. We have a lobbyist that we work with. We have been very actively involved. If you look at that Tri-Valley Cities Coalition, it covers just under 400,000 community members. We are a legislative voice that takes us to a top 10 city in California. So we leverage our resource to advocate on behalf of the town of Danville, and mainly advocating on behalf of local control. We know that there is a housing crisis. We know that we need to plan for housing, but we feel that your town council, your elected officials are the best representatives at the local government level to make decisions on housing in the town. So we are very actively involved. We have legislative meetings. We have met with the Senate Pro Tem's office. We try to shape the legislation. We try to blunt the legislation. We support legislation that is in Danville's best interest. And we advocate on behalf. We are very actively involved at town council's request. We have always been very actively involved in what is happening in Sacramento and its impact on Danville. These are your local elected officials in the town that actually represent the town. These are the elected officials that are making the decisions on the legislation that is impacting Danville. Next slide, please. Okay, now we've come to the Q&A, and we're going to ask Kat to facilitate that. I see we have quite a few.
Okay, so the first question we have is about ADUs, and the participant is asking how is the approval of placements on ADUs on units on properties conducted?
Sure, thank you. So it's a kind of long story, but it starts at the state level. If we went back early in the presentation, one of those many laws that the state of California has passed over the last few years is related to ADUs, and they've basically, under that law, set some maximum and minimum development standards for ADUs, and basically say you cannot prevent ADUs, and you have to allow ADUs to be built on pretty much any residentially zoned property. And so based on the state law, the town jurisdictions are required to adopt revised ordinances that incorporate and are consistent with the state law. So now that state law is part of the town's ordinance, it's basically the town that would approve an ADU when it comes forward. But our review authority is basically limited to issuing a building permit. And so when a building permit comes in, we'll verify it meets whatever the minimum required side and rear and front yard setbacks, the maximum size requirements, and the height limitations. So, some of the minimum development standards for setbacks are dictated by the state, and then the town takes those and actually issues the permits if they're compliant with those standards.
Great, thank you. The next question is, with the anticipation of the minimum 2,241 units that Danville needs to plan for, where do we anticipate the water will come from to service these units?
Well, we're in East Bay MUD's utilities district, so all water would be provided by East Bay MUD. This is a question that comes up quite a bit. We're in a drought, so there's kind of competing interests here. Housing and how does all this new housing get their water? So again, we are preparing an environmental impact report, and as part of that, we will be consulting with all of the service providers like East Bay MUD and with Central Sanitary District and others. So that's a question that will be answered as we go forward. Where will the water come from? And so that study will be done.
Great. What is the approval process on the new SB 9 bill with the town? Is it the same as the ADU process?
I don't know if we have real clarity yet on how that is going to be implemented. Just went into effect, I think, on Thursday. It'll be similar to the ADUs in that it's basically a ministerial process where we don't have discretion to say no. There's minimum standards such as you must have at least a 2,400 square foot resulting lot. You can't require public hearings. You can't go through a notification process. That if they meet minimum standards, that we must approve the subdivision. So we'll be going forward. I think the law goes into effect on January 1st. So we will be going through a review where we'll put together what that process will be and what submittal requirements will have to be given to the town for us to be able to review and verify the compliance with the laws.
Yeah, and there are some requirements around the lot split provision, and there are also some requirements around displacing rental units. But the lot split provision has that an owner, if they invoke the lot split, has to live on the property for 3 years. It's an affidavit process. You can't do it in a high fire zone, of which we are not. So there are some limits. You can't do a serial lot split or add ADUs to the bill that were changed during this whole process. And as Dave mentioned, that as soon as it is chaptered, we will get all the updates, and we will be talking about that in the future.
Great. Our next question is also related to the Senate bills that were just signed. So how will the recent signing of Senate Bill 9 and 10 affect the housing element update?
You want me to take that one?
Sure.
We don't know yet exactly because we'll need guidance from the state in order to count potentially project the number of units we might achieve through both of those bills. However, SB 10 at least is more a voluntary, allows governments to do things, whereas SB 9 is a ministerial action. So I would think the most impact would be from SB 9, if there were any. And my guess is just based on the idea that we're not going to get a huge number of units out of this because it would require a willing owner to develop their property that way. Plus, as Dave mentioned, all these requirements on the resulting size of lots, et cetera. And I doubt that there very many of them, if any at all, would be less than moderate income. I mean, I doubt even some of them would be even moderate. I think most will be above moderate income, seeing as how most truly affordable developments have to be developed at 30 units per acre in multifamily developments. So I don't think it's going to certainly won't impact the lower income need, but it might produce a few units in the above moderate income category.
And I just would like to add, part of what we were really focused on with these bills is that there is not an affordability component. What this does, and we think it could exacerbate and actually gentrify some neighborhoods, because there's going to be a lot of investment coming in, REITs, for some of this housing development through SB 9 and SB 10. And it is a tool for market rate housing, and it doesn't solve the problem of California needing low and extremely low income housing.
Great. Okay, so our next question is, I'm going to merge 3 questions together because they have to do with ADUs. If a resident adds an ADU onto their lot, is there a parking restriction? Does the unit get their own address, and are gutters required?
Well, that's pretty specific. So parking requirements for ADUs. So part of the state law that was passed by went into effect, I think, in January of 20, eliminated the need for on-site parking for most ADUs. It allows for, or requires that if any property is within a half mile of a transit line, that you cannot require on-site parking. And so that even means that in some cases you can convert your existing 2-car or 3-car garage into an ADU and not have to replace that with parking. And in some cases you do have to provide some on-site parking, but that's not garaged or carports. That can just be that you have parking space on your driveway. As far as the gutters, that's really kind of a building code question. And I think, when we see ADUs come in, depends on the location. I mean, water has to be controlled in such a way that it's caught and conveyed to an approved storm drain system. So that can be done in different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean you need gutters in every circumstance. As far as addresses, certainly you can have separate addresses for an ADU. It's really up to the property owner. And we basically just work with the post office and the fire department to assign addresses.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, this summer, the ISO had called several times for California residents to conserve power. Indeed, to turn everything non-essential off because there was insufficient electricity supply contracted for the next day. With the entire Western US in a drought, this is not a city or town problem, but how will housing efforts succeed if there is not enough electricity reliable to meet demand?
Yes, so this is another case where we certainly have competing priorities and issues coming from the state. We've seen that, part of the appeal that Diane talked about to ABAG is, the fact that putting a lot of housing units out in the suburbs like Danville exasperates other state requirements like reducing greenhouse gases and reducing, vehicle miles traveled on the freeways. So this is another concern, but again, as we go through our environmental impact report, the consultation with all the different utility companies to verify that they will provide service is something that will need to be done. And this is a question being asked by probably every city and every county throughout the state. And we know that in Southern California, where they're actually ahead of us in this cycle, so they're actually already having their housing elements submitted to the state. We know that both water and electrical provision types of concerns have not been the types of concerns that cities have been able to use to say that we can't provide this housing as we've been assigned.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question is it's going to be a heavy one. So we have a participant that actually has already gone to the ABAG website and took note that it states that membership is voluntary. So they're asking if this is true, and if so, what is the purpose of Danville still being a member in a bag? And if it's voluntary, can we exit and not have to address the assigned members?
I can take the first part of that having to do with arena allocation. Whether or not a jurisdiction is a member of ABAG does not mean that that jurisdiction somehow does not have to comply with arena allocation. The arena allocation is a state law. The membership in ABAG includes a number of other benefits, but in terms of the allocation of units, it has absolutely no impact on whether or not a jurisdiction would continue to receive arena allocation. Diane, perhaps you can share a little bit about what are the benefits of being part of ABAG.
Yes, and as we mentioned earlier, the town has been actually, at our town council's direction, has taken the lead at the regional level from an ABAG perspective to look at these numbers, appeal these numbers, impact these numbers. We have worked very closely with the Public Managers Association through Contra Costa County, the Mayor's Conference through Contra Costa County, as the leader to let the region know what is going on with ABAG. So we participated in the hearings. We had input in how the formula was being developed, and we challenged that. So the benefit to us being involved in this is that, and this is how we feel about being involved in Sacramento, is that we are at the table trying to impact and advocate on behalf of what we think is best for the town of Danville. So and we have been very, very actively involved in the leadership, and ABAG definitely knows who we are, and we will continue to advocate on that behalf. So on Danville's behalf. So that really is why we need to stay involved in this. These decisions are going to happen no matter what. And we really feel we're best served being at the table to really speak on behalf of the residents of Danville.
And maybe we need to follow up and maybe provide some information on our website. I believe that all 101 cities and 9 counties in the Bay Area are, in ABAG. Mm-hmm. So I suspect that there's also some serious downsides for not being in ABAG, or maybe some legal mandates, but I don't know exactly what those are. So maybe we can follow up with that question.
Continuing on from that question, I'm sure a lot of residents and even within the town, when we see the 2,241 units, that's quite a big number from what we've had in previous cycles. Danville is a small town, and our residents take a lot of pride in the small town feel that we have here. How do we, when we're planning for these units, how do we maintain that small town feel?
Yeah, so that's, that is everybody's concern. That's the town staff, that's our council and our planning commission and our residents and our businesses. Main concern is how, I think we all realize that there is a housing shortage, but how do we take these numbers and how do we incorporate them into Danville and maintain, what's really been important to us? It's something that we've really, I think, worked hard to preserve over the last 35 years since incorporation, and that's our small town character and our quality of life and what have you. So that's one of the reasons what we're reaching out to the public and trying to engage. We're trying to assess maybe what priorities might be for not touching at all, and we want to find sites where we maybe are outside of the core downtown area, that maybe we want to go higher densities on those and less acreage, or do we want to try to spread out the units? The problem is that we don't have a lot of vacant land in Danville that's developable. We have open space, public open space, and private open space areas that are not areas that we certainly would prioritize as far as sites that we would look at. I think we would look at underutilized sites in Danville, underutilized office or commercial sites, or older locations. But that's a challenge, and that's what we're looking for, some guidance from our our community from. And so the actual individual sites or sub areas that we'll be looking at, we'll be formulating those as we go forward, as we gain more public input.
Great. Our next question is, how does the town plan to engage with groups that are referred to as NIMBYs and the YIMBYs?
Well, I think, we want to engage with everybody that has an interest in housing. There's the YIMBYs, YIMBY group that is very much advocate for more affordable housing. And then there's others that kind of, like things the way they are and don't want to see much change. And so, we're going to have to we have some limitations on what we can and cannot do, what we have to do as part of the housing element. So we'll be engaging with all those groups and hopefully finding some consensus, some middle ground on the ways that we can go about accommodating our RHNA number.
Great. Our next question is going back to site selection. So we have a participant that specifically identified a site that St. Isidore's owns, and they're asking, are we reaching out to property owners to gauge interest or the feasibility of developing dense housing on properties? And how does that process go in terms of what qualifies to HCD?
Yeah, that's kind of a two-part question. I'll kind of answer the first part, and then maybe Diana, if you want to weigh in on what the state's looking for our sites. So, again, going forward, we're kind of trying to identify and prioritize the types of sites that we might consider. And again, do we look at office, older office sites, or do we look at older commercial centers and that type of thing? As we go forward, as we gain, hopefully we start to get some, additional input from residents, we start to kind of prioritizing the types of sites we're looking for. But at some point, yeah, we will have to engage with property owners to gauge their interest, because that's part of what the state will be looking at. We can't just kind of do a paper exercise. They have to be sites that have some likelihood of redeveloping over the next 8 years. And certainly when we get to a point where we actually have selected a site, we'll need to, and we have to do approve a general plan and a rezoning change. We'll have to be engaged with the property owners on that. And so Diana, maybe you can provide a little information on the vetting of the sites that the state will be looking at.
Sure. I think it's really important to remember that, even though a site may be on a list, doesn't mean that it's required to be developed in any way. But the requirement primarily is for the city to, or cities and towns to make it easier for developers of property to do development. If the owner of the property wants to do that, the decision to actually develop property will always rest with the owner, regardless of whether or not it's zoned differently. But with that, the state is really looking for sites. If there's not like green space available, i.e. vacant land that's available, which most jurisdictions, let's be honest, in the Bay Area do not have vacant land available anymore. Most jurisdictions are very much built out. What they're looking for is, what is the likelihood that this property could be redeveloped within the 8-year period? Whether or not the use on it is performing a high performer. For example, a local grocery store, the state says, we're not looking for you to turn over a grocery store. We're looking for things like old office buildings, for example, or marginal uses in fringe areas or something, or an older building. I know that in San Mateo County, as well as in Contra Costa County, both have experienced office conversions, either conversions or tear downs of older office buildings that are just not used anymore and developed into housing. So we have to look at a variety of things that are going on in the community, whether or not there are, it's a bustling use, or whether the building is vacant, whether it's older, whether it's ripe for development, whether a developer has expressed interest in developing a particular kind of property. So those are the things that we have to look at. We can't just say, okay, that's a site and we're going to take it. We have to consider a whole bunch of different factors in order to discern what's the best possible inventory we can create.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, some cities are trying to show that they meet their RENA requirement without a general plan amendment or lengthy CEQA analysis. Do you think that you will amend the general plan at the end of the housing element update to increase the zone capacity of the city, or do you think you will try to show HCD you can meet RENA with the current general plan zoning?
And so, part of the process is putting together a land use inventory. So, we have already done that. We know what lands in Danville are currently available for residential development. And it comes nowhere near to our RENA assignment. So, it does offset our RENA assignment somewhat because we do have vacant lands in Danville, limited, that are available for residential development. Very, very, very little in the 30 plus unit, lower, very low income category. So we will have to, if we're going to meet our RENA, we will have to approve some general plan changes, and we will have to do corresponding rezonings to that and do the CEQA work to support those changes.
Okay. Our next question is, are there parking requirements for non-ADU units?
For non-ADUs?
Mm-hmm.
Well, currently every single family and multifamily home in Danville has a parking requirement. However, for new developments, especially any new RENA sites, multifamily, low and very low income sites, the amount of parking required has been set by the state at numbers below what the town's ordinance would say or do say. So we're kind of preempted on parking, numbers of parking spaces. So, it could be as low as 1 parking space per unit under the state law that we don't have the ability to say no to. Our current zoning ordinances would say for multifamily housing, it's depending on the number of rooms in an apartment, it's 1.5 to 2 plus some guest parking, but that is lower under the current state laws.
Great. Our next question is in regards to these laws and HOA areas. So do HOAs have any recourse in these laws that are being put in place?
Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that no, they don't. So, just like all the local cities and counties, laws and ordinances have been preempted by state law, the same goes for any private entities or private agreements like HOAs who have CC&Rs. Those provisions are basically overwritten by the state laws, and private agreements among property owners under their HOA or CC&Rs would not prevail over the state laws.
Great. Okay, our next question is, are there options of trading housing numbers with other towns or cities in exchange for something that they may need? Perhaps Danville helping with beautification of a city or financial assistance for that city.
Yeah, Diana, I see you weighing in, so I'm going to let you take that one.
The answer is not in terms of accepting a RENA allocation. However, jurisdictions can work together on actual developments and perhaps work out agreements that the state would allow to receive credit for actual projects that are developed in one jurisdiction rather than another. But each jurisdiction gets its own allocation, and outside of the appeal process, which Diane had explained a little bit about, there isn't really a horse trading opportunity between Danville and other jurisdictions. The assignment for Danville is the assignment for Danville, unless it prevails in an appeal.
Great, thank you. Our next question is a question we've had before about the San Juan Valley Unified School District. And if we know of if they have any interest in redeveloping any of their land to include housing for teachers.
So, I know that San Juan Valley Unified School District has their site there on Sycamore Valley Road at Old Orchard. I don't know if they have any interest in moving from that location and redeveloping that site. That site, as well as many others around the site, will probably come up as we go through our discussion as we go forward, and maybe there will be some conversation with the school district, but I'm not aware of them actively advocating for housing on that site.
Great. Our next question is, given the amount of vacant land, would the town stop issuing single zoning permits to make sure it is available for these requirements for multi-residential use?
Can we or should we? Probably not. Currently, our town, every piece of dirt in Danville has a zoning district. So every property that's zoned for residential use has minimum development standards as far as setbacks and heights. And so in most of those cases, our review and approval of, say, an addition or an ADU or accessory structures, et cetera, on a property are not discretionary. They're not anything that the town can look at and decide yes or no because we put in some type of a judgment value on it. In most cases, if a addition meets the minimum requirements for setbacks and height, and they submit it for building a building permit and go through a plan check process, and they meet all building code requirements, we must issue a permit for those. And so, unless the town put some moratorium in place that prevented those or limited those, we don't have the ability to not issue those types of permits.
And I think that's one of the reasons why Governor Newsom signed SB 9 and SB 10. The state really just provided that resource on single family lots. So you can create what they refer to as missing middle housing or gentle density, where you can create a duplex. On lots that are eligible, you can subdivide a single family lot, and then you can also build up to 10 units by town council approval through SB 10. So in essence, the state just pretty much provided that type of flexibility in their single family zoning.
All right, our next question is, so Diane, you had mentioned that SB 9 has an owner occupancy requirement for a lot split. Our participant is asking, is there any way that an REIT could get involved, or how would that impact the?
I think when we look at an REIT, we're probably looking more at SB 10. When you look at SB 9, the duplex is where you would have people that would be looking to flip or to create a duplex. The SB 9 lot split provision that has the owner occupancy, it's an affidavit. We had hoped there would be more teeth. The owner just has to sign an affidavit that they will occupy or stay on, or be on the site for 3 years prior. But there is a lot of options as far as investors coming in, especially with SB 10, if you're looking at an institutional level.
No, I would just add to that the town currently has a short-term rental ordinance. We don't allow rentals for less than 30 days. So that's kind of the Airbnb and that type of rental, and the state law upholds that. The state law says that these units cannot be created for rentals that are less than 30 days.
Great. Our next question is, what happens if the town council does not approve the mandates from the state?
So Diana went through the penalties earlier in her presentation. I don't know, Diana, do you want to reiterate those?
Yes. Non-compliance would probably mean legal action by the state against the town. It would, because it would mean that our housing element was not compliant with state law. And as a consequence, when we're not in compliance, all kinds of things can happen without the town's control, which would be, as I mentioned, a combination of onerous fines, loss of important funding, as well as essentially a takeover of the city's building or the town's building process potentially by a judge. And so the consequences are much worse for not complying than at least complying and trying to do it in a way that will work for the town.
Yeah, and there's another bill that is sitting on the governor's desk that we're anticipating that he's going to sign, AB 215, which further creates oversight on our ability and our progress on the housing element and how we're meeting our numbers. And will also provide HCD, Housing and Community Development, with the ability to legally go after the town. So it's as Diana mentioned, there are more and more consequences for non-compliance.
Okay, our next question is, does unincorporated Danville count as part of Danville for these purposes? And if not, would incorporating that area and utilizing the border of Danville and Dublin be a helpful option?
Right, so no, unincorporated parts of Danville unincorporated parts of the county do not help Danville. Those, there was an earlier slide that showed all of the RENA assignments throughout the county, and the unincorporated county up there, housed up in Martinez, also has their numbers of, I think it was over 7,000 units. So the county, anything that's unincorporated in the county area is counted by the county and is not counted by the town of Danville. Would it help if we annexed areas out to our east? Yeah, theoretically, if we brought areas into the town of Danville, then they would be Danville land and they could count. One of the constraints in that area is that out Camino Tasahara, just past where a couple of county developments are on the south side, is the voter approved urban limit line. And so out beyond that, and this is before you get the Finley and Johnson roads out there, that's beyond the urban service boundary. And so there are no water or utility provisions out there. So I think most of that land is zoned agricultural, so they're all large lots, and you really couldn't do a general plan change and to any type of density that needed water and sewer out there without violating the urban service boundary. And I know, some of you have probably heard that the county recently approved a project out there that received an exception to the urban service boundary. They're actually beyond it, and they want to build over 100 homes. But that's problematic. There are a number of entities, including the town of Danville, that is filing suit against that project. So that's really not a viable option to go out beyond that urban service boundary.
Thank you, David. Our next question is going back to the school district. Looking at the property that schools have dedicated to parking lots, is it possible or feasible if the school district would decide to redevelop those parking lots to include housing above?
Well, that is definitely a potential option, I guess, that we would be open to looking at. If the school district wanted to do that, I know, for example, San Ramon Valley High recently added a lot of parking, which was great because it took a lot of pressure off of Danville streets in the North Hartz area. So, doing something over parking, again, if you build housing, then you're going to add additional parking demand. But, if there was school districts, are state property, but if, those school districts were interested in doing something like that and it made sense, then it would be definitely something that we would be interested in talking about.
Great. And our last question is there a limit on the number of animals at a house with an ADU unit and main house?
Our zoning ordinances don't differentiate between say a single family property with a house and an ADU or a house without an ADU. We do have limitations depending on your lot size on whether you can have larger animals like horses. You have to have at least an acre to have any horses. You have to have a certain size property to have hens or any type of fowl. There are limitations depending on your lot size on how many other types of animals, like farm type animals, you can have. Like obviously any house size can have a number of cats and dogs, but whether or not there's an ADU involved or not does not affect the animals regulations in our ordinance.
Great. And then we just have one more question. We had mentioned a voter approved protection out of Camino Tasahara that protects the land. Is there any action that residents can take as a voting constituency to protect our town from to stop future growth?
So maybe Diane, you can talk about the context at the state and regional levels.
You know, it's very important, and Kat, I'm wondering if you can go back to that slide with the contacts for Assembly Member Rebecca Bauer-Cahan and Senator Steve Glazer, because these decisions are state level decisions. It is really important that we communicate to our community members that it is important to engage the elected officials at the state level to ask these questions, share these concerns, and find out what is going on, and participate with us in our legislative committee meetings and listen to our legislative updates so that you stay engaged in what is happening in Sacramento. But these two individuals are the elected officials that are voting on these bills. And these are more and more as we have reviewed the legislation that is happening. The state feels that they can solve the housing crisis by production. And they are doing what they can to legislate housing production and therefore create density, and we're seeing it more and more. So we really, really are asking our community members to engage at the state level with their elected officials and come to our legislative committee meetings and our council meetings and stay informed on as far as what's happening. All right, was that the last question, Kat?
I saw a question pop up that asked about Alamo.
Yes, we did have one last question on the allocation for Alamo as it pertains to unincorporated Contra Costa County.
Right. So Alamo is unincorporated. It's not a city. They are under the jurisdiction of Contra Costa County, and so under the county, they're one part of the larger county that is assigned the 7,000 plus units countywide. So Contra Costa County will be going through a similar process that we will be going through, and as far as trying to decide where the most appropriate location to try to accommodate these units will be. And so whether or not the county, through their own processes, will decide that Alamo is an area that should receive some of those RENA units is really something that they will decide through their own process.
Great, and that's all we got.
Okay, so we would like to thank you for participating this morning. We would like to encourage you this is a process that is going to continue to the end of next year. We are going to continue to reach out. We are asking that you participate in this process with us so that our council can receive your feedback and make informed decisions. We have our towntalks.org portal that you can go to. It is the only place, it's not a next door. This is the only place where we can talk to you directly online. So we're encouraging anybody that is, presenting feedback on Nextdoor to come to our site, talk to us. We'll provide answers to you. We have an email address. You can text your questions. You can text your housing stories to us using this portal. We will continue to update you on this process through this portal. And then we will be launching the interactive tool in the spring on this portal. So, and we are available to come out and talk to community groups as far as meetings. So we are continuing to engage our community. We thank you very much for participating this morning. We hope you spread the word, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.